just a little bit about the topic. I mean, as Karen was saying, it, from the pupil's point of view, I'm sure their interest has been greatly aroused by events since February and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so I'm going to try a little bit to bring that in as I'm talking about the development of Russian history between 1881 and 1921. But I'm sure that now, and as the year goes on, this will be a relevant link into a study of the field. I know that, from a personal biographical point of view, I kind of came into all this doing Russian history during the middle of the Cold War. It was actually in the Khrushchev period, and I got into it partly because the Cold War was so fascinating. The conflict between the West and Russia was in some respects at its height by 1956. And I think that'll be true also for pupils now, that they will actually have a greater interest in the topic, and it will have a greater relevance. It's probably fair to say that Russian studies went into a decline after 1991 with all the chaos and the difficulties and the formlessness of the post-Gorbachev period. But I think interest is now will now be picking up, and I think in some respects it's an ill cloud that blows nobody good. There's something does come of it, a greater interest, at least in Russia. And also, if you look at Putin and what's happening in Russia, there are really quite deep roots or deep connections with what was happening in Russia in our period, both in the extremely conservative period of late Tsardom, or the late imperial period, but also in the Civil War, where you could argue that the nationalistic views of Putin have a great similarity with Russian conservatives of the late 19th century, but also with the White Guards in the Civil War of 1917 to 1920. And I'll try to bring those things out as I progress. A bit about myself. Philip was talking about my background in Russian history. I have, partly because of the collapse of Russia in the 1990s, moved elsewhere. It just became less interesting until February 2022. So I worked on the Second World War, and I wrote a book on Russia, the Russian front in the Second World War. Before that, I'd written about Stalin, and my career kind of worked forward from the revolution up until something like the present time. And my research as a postgraduate was on the Civil War period and the revolution. But before that, or after that, I taught extensively in Russian history at the University of Glasgow. And my period of interest goes back a long way, certainly to 1689 and the era that begins with Peter the Great, what we think of as modern imperial Russia. And that's valuable and useful because you can't really understand Russia where it was in 1881 without going back a ways to look at the formative influences. So that's basically what I bring to the table. I suppose the way I'm going to approach this is to look at Russia in the period from 1881 to 1921 as 4 distinct periods, and to try to look within each of those periods at the major factors which are at work. So the first period would be from 1881 to 1894, which you could call the good old days of Alexander II, when the autocracy seemed to be pretty solid. Second period would be from 1894, death of Alexander III, the accession of Emperor Nicholas II, up until 1904, which again was a time of remarkable change in Russia, but not of crisis. 1905 to 1917 would be the difficult years for Nicholas II, beginning with the Japanese War in 1904, 1905, then with the revolution, then with a series of radical changes to the internal structure of Russia, political and economic, and culminating in the First World War and the abdication of Nicholas in February. And the final period is the one from the revolution up until 1921. 1921 is when the Civil War ended. That's, I suppose, the basic turning point which will come to mind, and the beginning of what is called the new economic policy, a kind of fundamental change of the situation. But certainly 1921 is a point where Lenin looks back and says, well, this is where we've got with all this stuff, and what are we going to do now? We're in a kind of, well, what the Russians call a tupik. We're in a kind of dilemma, and the question is how can we deal with that? So in each of those four periods, what I'm going to try to do is look at the different elements, which would be politics, society, economics, nationalism, and by that I mean primarily minority nationalism, national awareness among the non-Russian population, and also to look at Russia in an international context. What were Russia's problems with the outside world? And all of those things are interconnected. For example, a lot of the reforms come from a sense of a desire to compete in the outside world with more developed powers. A lot of the discussions throughout are about how do we relate to the West? Are we part of the West, or are we something quite different? And as your pupils will have realized and will know as 2022 and 2023 progress, is that discussion is very much still relevant for Russians, for non-Russians or ethnic non-Russians, for the ruling elite in Russia. And it's also, as you might not have thought, very relevant for the West as well, how the West will react to this changing Russia. So I suppose what I would say before I launch into it is that it's remarkable how relevant Russian history is to an understanding of current events. So 1881 is the beginning of the period as a whole. It begins with a bang. A literal bang in the sense of the assassination of Emperor Alexander II in St. Petersburg. Alexander II was, as you know, the Tsar Liberator, the man who had brought about the emancipation of the serfs 20 years before. It was a time when Russia, the Russian government had to cope with something of a political crisis, and it did succeed in destroying the revolutionary movement which had brought about the assassination of Alexander II. It destroyed that movement relatively quickly. It was a small elite movement from the Russian intelligentsia. It had no functional popular base, which is partly why the revolutionaries of that era had fallen back on terrorism and the attempt to actually assassinate the Tsar and other leaders. But once the revolutionary movement had been contained, the government of Alexander III seemed relatively strong. It had inherited a number of things which gave it a sense of purpose and a sense of strength, one of which was autocracy. Russia had always been an autocratic state. It continued in that way, or it had, that goes back to the 15th century and the creation of the Russian state, but it had not entertained rivals, and it had been a remarkably effective and powerful state. It had been highly centralized, around Moscow. If you compare, for example, the Russian Empire and the Habsburg Empire, there are big differences in the degree of control from the center in one as compared to the other. It was economically strong, although it was largely a peasant country with a rural economy. It had, in the 1880s and 1890s, the beginning of an economic upturn in the form of industrialization, largely in the form of state-sponsored industrialization. And one of the features of Russia at that time and now was that things happened because the state wanted them to happen. It was in the interest of the autocratic state to develop powerful, or at least elements of a powerful industry, if it was going to compete with the rapidly changing states of Western Europe and in America in the second half of the 19th century. That required industry, it required railways. If Russia was to be able to compete economically with the outside world, and more important, if it was to hold its own militarily in conflict with the outside world. The Crimean War of 1854-56 had been a kind of test for Russia, a test which Russia had not handled well. The fact that the Crimea is not insignificant to events today, and the effect of the role of Crimea in Putin's worldview and his view of the outside world. But in any event, that war in the middle of the 19th century was a kind of catalyst for the Russian government to bring about or to try to bring about changes. And again, as many of you will know, the irony is that the creation of a working class, of modern industry, of elements of an educated middle class were all things that were required for this economic and military modernization, but were fundamentally fatal for the imperial government as it existed in 1881. The other thing I suppose one could say about this state was, and again to think in terms of the Ukraine, is that it was centralized and largely Russian. The state was following at this time a policy of Russification. Russification meaning the encouragement of Russians, the co-option of local elites in the peripheral areas, on the whole, not educating. The school system as it was didn't involve education in non-Russian languages. There wasn't much of a non-Russian press. All of those things made it appear that Russia was a pretty monolithic and effective state in terms of its national minorities, and it held very borders deep into Russia. Russia had succeeded under Catherine the Great, especially in extending its borders west through Poland and south into most of what we now call the Ukraine. That became, along with the Crimea, that became part of Russia in the middle and late 18th century. So that state was on the whole successful. There was one element I should have mentioned before I go on, and that is that the state was also one where, in intellectual terms, there was a division between camps. Now, this is both in terms of the government, but also in terms of the movement of the intelligentsia and the educated classes, and that was between Westernizers and Slavophiles. This debate goes back a long way, and it comes forward a long way to Putin, but it's about, is Russia a Western state? Is it destined to become a Western state like Germany or France or Britain? Or is it something different? Is it something based in Europe and Asia, a Eurasian state, a state with a uniquely Slavic culture, which cannot be, that culture cannot be molded into something different, something which is like the Western state. Anyway, that's a current concern. So the second phase is 1894 to 1894 to 1904. Again, a lot of the things that are going on in the period of Alexander III also happened under Nicholas II. That the state is relatively strong. It undergoes it is the program of industrialization and attempts to modernize all aspects of the economy, including agriculture, are to some extent developed during these years. It also, at this time, still accepts no form of limitation on the role of the autocracy. And in this respect, one can say that Russia is unlike most of the states of Europe. I mean, in my view, Russia is a European state. But by the time you get to the 1890s, most European states have some form of public representation, some kind of a civic society. Even Germany and Austria have functioning parliaments. None of those things are true of Russia, where the Tsar is all powerful. He obviously has courtiers. There's a court faction. There's a loyal army. But there is no attempt at popular representation, and that is regarded as unacceptable by the emperor. And on the whole, that line is held in a kind of static way, even though Nicholas II is less of an effective ruler than his father had been, Alexander III. Alexander III died relatively young. Nicholas II was not did not develop the same kind of power base which Alexander III had, and everyone knows the difficulties which he had with his own particular household and so on. But nevertheless, until 1904, Russia is stable. What happens in 1905 is and 1904, 1905 is the beginning of the third period. It starts with the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, 1905, which is partly a response to Russian attempt to expand its territory in Siberia and in Manchuria, even in northern Korea. And in a way, which is not effectively controlled by the Tsar. But in a way, it's important. It also links to the rise of other states around Russia, one of which is Japan. And what is so surprising is that Russia is the first of the European states to suffer a setback in Asia at the hands of one of the Asiatic powers. It creates a huge crisis in Russia because the war goes very badly, both on land and on the sea. It sparks off an internal revolution in Russia, which is driven partly by land hunger, by the fact that the emancipation of the serfs in 1861 hadn't provided enough land for the peasantry. It also, a feature of the times is that the Russian middle class demands the kind of voice in the running of the country which has become the norm in much of Western and Central Europe. So you have a war and you have a revolution. It's very like what happens in 1914 to 1917, except that the war is less disastrous. But the government is able to work its way out of the crisis, partly by granting concessions, political concessions, particularly in the form of a parliament, the State Duma, which for the first time gives an element of popular representation, partly by attempts at land reform, by trying to satisfy the peasants in one way or another, partly by trying to garner support in the countryside by rallying the rich peasants, the so-called Stalip reform, and partly by continued repression, and that period is one which I think arouses great controversy even now among historians, and that is, can we say that between 1905 and 1914, the Russian state had in fact been able to carry out the kind of measures which would have brought stability, that they were actually on the right track, and that those measures were only put off course by the beginning of the First World War. Or can we say that, as another group of historians would argue, that by 1905, Russia was already in an extremely challenging position. And some of the forces that had been released in 1905 or permitted in 1905 became very important later on in 1917, when, in effect, this is a oversimplification, but in effect, the Duma seizes power, and the state and the autocracy more or less collapses. The third phase is 1917 to 1921. I've left that to last. I don't have a lot of time to talk about that, but it's obviously very, very important. Again, the role of the First World War in the crisis in 1917 is terribly important. Would the Bolsheviks have come to power without the First World War? Worth bearing in mind, I haven't talked about the Bolsheviks before, but the Bolsheviks are in effect a party based on international revolution, and in converting the First World War into an international civil war. They see things, their leadership sees things in very, very broad terms. And in fact, to some extent, the Leninist seizure of power in October 1917 is only understandable and justifiable in intellectual terms, or Marxist intellectual terms, if the assumption is that it is a revolution in a backward country that will succeed because it will be the trigger of an international revolution, a revolution outside which will follow the Bolshevik revolution. In any event, the Civil War is a time of great crisis. It involves more deaths for the Russian state, the Russian people, than did the war in First World War in 1914 to 1917. If you include deaths from disease in the chaotic times of the Civil War, then it is considerably higher. It would be an oversimplification to say this is a war between reds and whites. But you can partly see it that way, but it is becoming, in addition to that, a war which involves the national minorities, almost for the first time. The 1905 revolution had not been a revolution which had a very strong national dimension. I mean, there was dissatisfaction. There were riots and there were activities outside the Russian core, but they weren't central to the events of 1905. That is pretty much also true in 1917 as well, where the crisis is primarily about the Russian autocracy, the Russian Duma, and events within Russia. That does begin to change in 1918, 1919, when the dimension of the national minorities becomes a very important one. It is a three-sided civil war, a civil war between the Reds, the Whites, and the national minorities. The Reds obviously are opposed to the Whites on intellectual grounds, on how they see the Russian state. Many of the leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution are not ethnic Russians. Trotsky, Stalin, for example, aren't ethnic Russians, and so the non-Russian element within the intelligentsia is very important. But also, the view of the whites towards the ethnic minorities is also important. If the whites had been able to make a common cause with the ethnic minorities, they might have been able to overwhelm the Bolsheviks, to overwhelm the Reds. But there was a fundamental antipathy between the Russian nationalists of the white movement and the minorities of the Russian periphery, as strong an antipathy as there was between whites and Reds. And in many ways, this is where the Putin thing comes in. Putin's view of the national minorities especially Ukrainians, is very, very similar to white generals like General Denikin, Admiral Kolchak, and General Wrangel during the Civil War, and he often cites that a lot. And one of the things that Putin stresses when he's talking about the Civil War is the sense that that somehow it's Lenin's fault that the Ukraine becomes a major problem. Now, Putin, whatever Putinism is, it's hard to see how it relates to Leninism. I mean, one could talk for hours about that particular connection. But one of the things that Lenin does, Lenin is you could describe him as autocratic, as a dictator, as an ideologue. And by the way, I would stress with teaching the subject, you really have to give people a sense of what Russian Marxism was really all about. In some respects, in some respects, Lenin was a quite rigid ideologue, especially in his stress on the so-called dictatorship of the proletariat, with the stress on dictatorship. But also, in some ways, he was quite pragmatic, in the sense that he realized that it was important to gain the support of some of the peasants in the Civil War. He realized that it was important to gain the support of some of the minorities, or some elements of the minorities in the Civil War. And so, unlike some people in the Bolshevik Party, and certainly unlike the whites, Lenin was prepared to accept a form of national independence on the part of the minorities, cultural independence of the minorities, in particular the Ukrainians. And so, by the time you get to the end of the Civil War, there's an independent Ukrainian state, there's an nominally independent Ukrainian state, a nominally independent Belarusian state, a nominally independent Transcaucasian state. All of these things are elements that are generated by Lenin, which he sees as being essential for consolidating the Russian base within central Russia. Now, to some extent, you can call those minority states puppets, but also what happens in the period of Lenin's lifetime and afterwards is that culturally those minorities develop. Culturally, they're given their own press, they're given their own educational systems, and those things create a stronger sense of nationalism in the long term that would have been there before. And that's why Putin would describe Ukraine as a number of things. He could describe it as being Nazi, or based on National Socialist principles. But also, he blames Lenin for having brought about the creation of this bastard state in the Ukraine during the Civil War. So the Civil War, anyway, ends. It also includes an element of Western intervention, British, American, mainly British and French, and Japanese, to some extent American. That's important in a way because it feeds long-standing Russian paranoia about the aspects of foreign policy. What for Putin is NATO enlargement in the 21st century. In the Civil War period, certainly post-Civil War, the Stalin regime cites back to the Civil War as a reason why Russia has to be fearful of the Western states. So that continuity is there as well. In any event, the Civil War ends in 1921. It ends with a red victory. It ends with the expulsion of the white armies from Russia. It ends with the declaration of a new economic policy, which is another example of Lenin's flexibility. What Lenin says now is, well, we can't actually convert the peasants to socialism overnight. If you want to keep the support of the peasant movement, if you want to avoid peasant unrest, we have to give the peasants what they want. And that is a pretty wide-standing land reform in which the peasants are control of their own farmsteads, and they have the ability to trade with the towns without state intervention. This is regarded as being a relatively short-term concession, but it is a fundamental change, and it is partly how Lenin is able to bring about a stability in 21, which lasts for a considerable time. But there is one final point that I want to make about all this, and that is that, again, I say ideology is very important, and you have to really go into this with pupils to understand the motivations of various leaders. But ideology means, in this sense, very, very crudely, that you can only have a socialist revolution if you have the preconditions of that socialist revolution. If you have a bourgeoisie, if you have a large industrial working class, which is increasingly marginalized and threatened by the developments of capitalism. What is peculiar about Russia in 1921 is it doesn't have those things. And Lenin draws attention to this in 1921, and it partly drives his policies and Stalin's policies after that. And the point about how Lenin sees things now, after all these events, after the revolution, after the Civil War, is that Russia actually wasn't ready for revolution. The preconditions weren't there for a revolution in one country, in Russia, because Russia was so backward. Russia had no strong middle class. It had no bourgeoisie. It had only a small working class. Most of that working class and most of the cities were greatly reduced by the events of the Civil War. So the crisis now, or the choice now, is that if we haven't got the preconditions to create a socialist government, but we do have a socialist government, our task is to create the preconditions. So it's kind of an absolutely backwards approach to how you bring about socialism in Marxian terms in Russia. And it's what leads on to the developments of the 1920s and 30s. And I would say finally that if you are teaching this period, it's important to go into Stalinism a little bit and say what happens in under collectivization. How does that relate to what didn't happen in the period from 1881 to 1921, and also how the Stalin cult emerges, and how does that react? How does that relate to the nature of Russian political culture between 1881 and 1921? So that's really all I've got to say. If you have any questions, please let me know.